Caleb Vance sat at his metal desk, the ambient hum of the planetary logistics terminal vibrating gently through the floorboards of the Soulmir administrative block. Outside, the pale stone towers of the capital stretched toward a silver-threaded sky, a masterclass in organic architecture where every corner curved away from conflict. For 10 years, Caleb had cultivated a life defined by invisibility, wearing the nondescript uniform of a human trade clerk and filing shipping manifests with meticulous precision. To the local Sylvan populace, humanity was a recent addition to the Galactic Coalition, viewed as mathematically inclined, emotionally reserved, and fundamentally unsuited for the brutal frontline warfare that had defined the Ashfall era. Across the narrow aisle, Grace glanced up from her data slate, her amber eyes catching the shifting light of the towers. She had worked alongside Caleb for 3 years, long enough to recognize the subtle rigidity in his posture, the way his hand twitched instinctively toward an empty holster whenever a heavy crate dropped on the pavement outside. "You're doing that thing again, Caleb," she murmured, her voice carrying a light, teasing cadence that she reserved exclusively for him. "Waiting for a sky to fall that stopped tumbling a decade ago." "It's a trade delegation meeting, not a combat drop." Caleb forced a brief, tight smile, burying his hands back into his terminal interface to quiet the phantom alarms echoing in the deep recesses of his memory. The assignment seemed simple enough on paper. Act as a background escort and logistics liaison for a routine diplomatic summit at the Imperial High Spire. Yet, as Caleb and Grace walked through the sprawling, chiming streets toward the palace, an inexplicable weight pressed heavily against his chest. Sylvan citizens paused to watch them pass, their long, pale fingers gesturing softly as children peeked out from behind flowering trellises. They were heading toward a formal audience with the reigning monarch, Queen Vesperia, an honor rarely granted to low-level trade workers. Caleb told himself it was just bureaucratic redundancy, a routine formality to cement human-Sylvan relations, refusing to let his mind wander toward the darker, blood-soaked history buried beneath the city's pristine limestone foundations. The grand hall of the High Spire opened before them like a cathedral of light and polished silver, its vaulted ceiling disappearing into a warm, luminous haze. Rows of nobles clad in deep indigo robes lined the long processional path, whispering quietly in melodic tones that rose and fell like a gentle wind moving through an autumn forest. At the far end, elevated on a dais of carved pearl stone, sat Queen Vesperia. Her pale skin was marked with intricate silver patterns that pulsed softly under the ambient illumination, carrying the mask of absolute, unyielding royal composure. Beside her throne sat a small, restless child, Princess Lyra, who was picking absently at the embroidered edge of her sleeve, entirely bored by the drone of the herald reading through the formal delegation roster. Grace nudged Caleb slightly as they took their place near the rear of the human delegation, her sharp gaze scanning the architectural layout of the room. Unusual for a queen to mandate personal attendance for standard trade liaisons, she whispered under her breath, her eyes flicking toward the elite imperial guards stationed by the heavy obsidian doors. Caleb nodded slowly, keeping his chin level and his shoulders back, adopting the posture of a soldier who had spent a lifetime learning how to blend into the scenery. He kept his eyes fixed on a point just above the throne, deliberately avoiding the murals and plaques lining the corridor outside, murals that whispered of a time when this magnificent palace had been half turned to ash by an enemy that did not negotiate. As the herald finally called out Caleb's name, Master Sergeant Caleb Vance, human logistics escort, he stepped forward to execute the standard diplomatic bow. It was a practiced, hollow movement meant to signal peaceful intent between two vastly different species. But the moment his head lifted to face the dais, the ambient noise of the grand hall vanished. Princess Lyra had stopped swinging her legs entirely. Her small hand froze against the fabric of her dress, and her wide, silver-rimmed eyes locked onto Caleb's face with an intensity that defied her youth. It was a look of pure, unadulterated recognition, as though she were staring at a ghost summoned straight from a recurring nightmare she had lived through every night of her life. The silence that fell over the grand hall was absolute and suffocating, spreading outward from the dais like ripples across a frozen lake. Slowly, the young princess leaned toward her mother, tugging frantically at the deep indigo fabric of the Queen's sleeve while keeping her terrified gaze locked squarely on Caleb. Though her voice was barely more than a tremulous whisper, the acoustic perfection of the hall carried every single syllable to the farthest corners of the room. "Mom. That's the human who left us behind on the burning ship." The words hit the marble floor like shattering glass, instantly shattering Queen Vesperia's carefully constructed royal mask as her eyes snapped to Caleb with a fierce, blinding intensity. Around them, the murmuring nobility erupted into a chaotic flurry of movement and whispered alarm. Commander Vane, the head of the Imperial Guard, slammed the butt of his ceremonial pike against the stone floor, his sharp, angular features twisting with immediate, focused suspicion. Guards dropped their hands to their sidearms, their bodies shifting into tactical formations designed to neutralize a potential assassin or high-level imposter. "Your Majesty," Vane barked, stepping protectively in front of the throne. "A name and a face can be fabricated from public memorial records. No human walks into this palace uninvited unless they have a hidden agenda." Caleb took an involuntary step back, his heart hammering against his ribs as a cold sweat broke out across his neck. Yet Queen Vesperia did not order him arrested. Instead, she slowly descended the steps of the pearl stone dais, her indigo robes trailing over the polished floor as she approached Caleb with an unnerving, deliberate grace. The nobles fell deathly quiet once more, watching in stunned disbelief as their monarch bypassed all protocol to stop mere inches away from an ordinary human logistics clerk. Her fingers hovered near Caleb's left forearm, trembling slightly before she reached out and gently pulled back his uniform sleeve, exposing a jagged, pale scar running along his skin. "I remember this," she whispered, her voice cracking with suppressed emotion. "You didn't look back, you just pushed the manual override and sealed the hatch." The name of the battle slipped unbidden from Caleb's lips before he could stop it: the dreadnought breach over Sector 4. The moment he spoke the words, the past he had spent 10 years burying tore through his mental defenses with the force of a breaching charge. He was suddenly 25 years old again, standing knee-deep in cooling plasma and electrical fire aboard a dying orbital platform as the sky burned with the orange-red fury of the Scourge fleet. Back then, humanity had only been part of the Galactic Alliance for a handful of years, eager to prove their worth in a war they barely understood against an enemy that consumed worlds like locusts. His squad had been tasked with holding the central evacuation umbilical until every last civilian transport cleared the docking bay. Princess Lyra slipped down from her seat on the dais, running over to tug at the hem of Caleb's uniform just as she had done in the terrifying, smoke-choked corridors a decade ago. "Mom always told me the story," the little princess said, looking up at him with unblinking, wide silver eyes. "She said the human held the escape pod latch open with his bare hands while the whole ship was tearing apart, and then the outer airlock blew." The sheer matter-of-fact innocence in her voice cut through Caleb's professional detachment more painfully than any physical blow, reminding him of the suffocating terror of that night, the deafening scream of twisting metal, and the frantic weight of hundreds of lives resting on a single pair of human hands. Grace stepped up beside Caleb, her face pale and stunned, her previous professional calm entirely fractured by the revelation. 3 years, she whispered, looking at him with a mix of shock and deep, resonant hurt. "We worked together for 3 years, Caleb, and you never once mentioned you were a war hero. That you were the one who bought the evacuation window for half the royal court." Caleb could not look her in the eye. How could he explain that he hadn't considered himself a hero? To him, it had simply been a bad night where his communications officer, his squad mates, and half his unit had vanished into the void while he had miraculously washed up in a debris drift, carrying a survivor's guilt so profound that he chose a life of quiet anonymity over medals and parades. Commander Vane refused to let the emotional weight of the reunion override his tactical paranoia, stepping closer with his hand resting firmly on the hilt of his blade. "Your Majesty, with all due respect, sentimentality does not rewrite security protocols," Vane insisted, his eyes narrowing as he glared at Caleb. "If he survived an orbital destruction event that left no biological trace in the official logs, how do we know whose interests he is serving now? The Scourge remnants have operated in the Outer Rim for years. Spies can be conditioned, memories altered, identities fabricated. The murmurs among the nobility grew louder, splitting the court between those who viewed Caleb through the lens of religious reverence and those who saw him as an immediate, uncalculated security threat. Queen Vesperia silenced her commander with a single, sharp raise of her hand, her eyes never leaving Caleb's weathered face. You cannot fabricate a biological scar, Vane, nor can you fake the micro-tremors of a soldier who recognizes the exact ghost he left behind in the fire, she stated firmly, her voice carrying the absolute authority of a monarch who had learned to rule through profound personal loss. She turned back to Caleb, her expression softening into something devastatingly vulnerable. You gave us your life that night, Sergeant Vance. The Coalition records listed you among the lost because your escape pod beacon failed in the upper atmosphere. Why didn't you come forward when you were recovered? Because coming back meant facing what I lost, Caleb finally admitted, his voice rough and stripped of all defense mechanisms as the weight of a decade crashed down upon him. When I woke up in a recovery ward 3 systems away, my unit was gone, my friends were ashes, and the war was over. I didn't want to be a symbol, I just wanted to be quiet. The Grand Hall remained dead silent, the nobles listening in stunned awe as a human, a species they had long categorized as cold, logical, and transactional, revealed an emotional depth and burden they had never thought possible. Yet, before the emotional tension could fully settle, the palace's primary communication array chimed with a frantic, pulsing red alert that shattered the quiet. The automated klaxons began to wail throughout the high spire, a low, rhythmic pulse that drove every trace of peace from the pristine white halls. Commander Vane's data slate lit up with incoming telemetry streams from the planetary defense grid, his professional composure instantly shifting into hyper-focused adrenaline. Your Majesty, Sensor Command is reporting an unauthorized jump signature at the outer edge of the system, Vane announced, his voice ringing out clearly across the stunned court. Unidentified vessels, small, aggressive, and broadcasting encrypted subspace frequencies identical to Scourge remnant swarms. They're bypassing our automated listening posts on a direct vector toward the capital. Panic threatened to ripple through the gathered nobles once more, but Queen Vesperia immediately locked into wartime command mode, her posture straightening as decades of royal training took over. What is our current defense posture? She demanded, turning sharply toward her military commander. Vane grimaced, his fingers flying across his slate to pull up tactical overlays. Our orbital platforms were reconfigured for trade and civilian transit over the last 8 years following the disarmament treaties. We have heavy interceptors docked at the polar stations, but the capital's inner ring has 0 active combat shielding. If those ships reach the atmosphere, the high spire will be entirely defenseless. Caleb felt the familiar, cold clarity of combat wash over him, instantly washing away the haze of his civilian logistics work. His eyes scanned the structural schematics projected by Vane's slate, his military instincts, honed by years of survival, instantly identifying the catastrophic gaps in the city's organic architecture. They aren't here for a random raid, Caleb said, stepping forward without hesitation, his voice cutting through the rising panic like a knife. They picked up the high-frequency diplomatic subspace chatter from today's summit. They know the Queen and the entire royal delegation are concentrated right here in the high spire. They're coming to finish what they started 10 years ago. With only hours before the incoming vessels could breach the planet's upper atmosphere, the Grand Hall transformed from a ceremonial court into a frantic command center. Queen Vesperia did not hesitate to place her trust in the human logistics clerk, granting Caleb and Commander Vane joint tactical authority over the palace defenses. Show us what you did at the Vaneth Bridge, Sergeant Vance, Vesperia commanded quietly, her eyes locking onto his with absolute conviction. Caleb nodded, grabbing a holographic tactical projector and sweeping his hand across the map of Soulmir's winding, beautiful, but strategically flawed stone streets. The Sylvan architects designed this city for beauty, not war, Caleb explained rapidly, pointing out natural choke points among the curved towers and glass bridges. That's our advantage if we use it right. We don't try to meet them in open airspace where their swarm ships have the speed advantage. We funnel them into the narrow inner courtyards and the grand approaches of the spire where their numbers don't matter, and every meter of ground has to be bought with blood. Vane stared at the tactical layout, a grudging, fierce respect replacing his initial suspicion. Within minutes, palace maintenance crews and startled trade delegates were mobilized, repurposing industrial mining equipment and emergency plasma struts into makeshift barricades. Grace surprised everyone by stepping up to the communications console, her fingers flying across the relay systems to establish an encrypted grid between the scattered guard posts and the orbital defense platforms. I didn't spend 5 years in military logistics before transferring to trade administration just to watch a pretty city get flattened, she muttered with a grim smile, her calm, authoritative voice immediately stabilizing the panicked chatter on the comms channels. Princess Lyra, meanwhile, refused to be evacuated to the deep bunkers, instead stubbornly clinging to the edge of Caleb's tactical belt with a fierce, quiet determination that mirrored her mother's royal resolve. The sky above Soulmir turned a sickly shade of bruised purple as the enemy vanguard broke through the atmosphere, descending upon the capital like a swarm of angry hornets. Automated planetary defense batteries managed to clip 2 of the incoming craft, sending them spinning into the uninhabited outer planes in blinding flashes of orange fire. But 4 agile combat skiffs slipped past the net and targeted the high spire directly. True to Caleb's tactical prediction, the swarm units bypassed the outer residential sectors and slammed straight into the upper garden terraces, deploying ground infiltrators designed to slice through administrative bulkheads and capture high-value targets. Commander Vane's guards met the first wave at the curved stone bridge connecting the palace gardens to the main tower, holding the narrow choke point with absolute, disciplined ferocity. But Caleb's tactical intuition, forged in the brutal fires of the Ashfall War, warned him that a smart enemy wouldn't just hit the front door. Grace, check the internal structural telemetry on the east wing, Caleb shouted into his comlink as he sprinted away from the main command deck, his boots echoing sharply down the pristine limestone corridors. There's an old service conduit from the pre-war expansion era that bypasses our primary security grid entirely. Grace's voice cracked through his earpiece, tight with sudden, chilling panic. Caleb. East Wing, Sub-Level 3. The internal sensor array just went dark, and the security detail assigned to the Royal Children's safe room isn't responding. Caleb didn't hesitate. He drew a sidearm from a fallen guard's holster, his heart dropping into his stomach as he realized the nightmare was repeating itself. The enemy hadn't just come to raid the palace. They had exploited a forgotten architectural flaw to slip past the defenses and target the inner chambers where Princess Lyra and the remaining royal dependents had been sequestered for safety. Caleb pushed through the heavy blast doors of the east wing, finding the corridor terrifyingly silent and devoid of life. The emergency lighting had shifted to a dim, crimson glow, casting long, menacing shadows across the pale stone walls. 2 Imperial guards lay unconscious near the threshold, brought down by non-lethal neural charges rather than lethal plasma fire, a tactical precision that confirmed the infiltrators were hunting high-value hostages rather than engaging in random destruction. At the far end of the corridor, the reinforced door to the inner safe room stood wide open, its locking mechanism melted into glowing slag by concentrated thermal plasma. Stepping cautiously into the ransacked chamber, Caleb caught sight of a small, familiar shoe lying near an overturned table. Down a narrow, unmapped service tunnel leading deeper into the bedrock beneath the palace, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. A small, steady voice doing its absolute best not to shake. "I am not afraid of you," Princess Lyra's voice echoed bravely down the dark stone shaft. "My mother's guards are already here, and the human always comes back." Rage and adrenaline surged through Caleb's veins, obliterating the last remnants of the tired, broken veteran he had pretended to be for the past 10 years. He lunged into the dark service tunnel, rounding the corner just as a sleek, multi-limbed infiltration drone raised a heavy stun rifle toward the trembling princess trapped against the back wall. Caleb didn't think, he reacted with the savage, brutal efficiency of a soldier who had survived the impossible. He threw his entire body between the mechanical assassin and the child, firing his sidearm in rapid succession until the drone's power core detonated in a shower of white-hot sparks. The blast threw him against the stone wall, but he instantly scrambled back to his feet, pulling the shaking princess into his arms as the smoke cleared from the dim subterranean corridor. When Caleb carried Princess Lyra back up to the main courtyard, the immediate battle for the high spire was already over. Combined ground forces and the newly repositioned orbital interceptors had driven off the remaining swarm skiffs, leaving the capital bathed in the warm, golden light of a breaking dawn. Queen Vesperia rushed forward, tears streaming down her pale face as she snatched her daughter into an embrace so fierce it seemed as though she would never let go. When she finally looked up at Caleb, standing bruised, soot-stained, and bleeding slightly from his shoulder, she did not see a humble logistics clerk or a forgotten ghost. She saw the beating heart of an unyielding alliance. "You said you weren't a soldier anymore," Queen Vesperia whispered softly, stepping forward and pressing her palm against the pale scar on his forearm in a gesture of profound, eternal gratitude. "You said you couldn't promise the same outcome twice." Caleb looked down at Princess Lyra, who solemnly handed him a small, unevenly drawn picture of a tall human standing beside a little alien princess in front of a bridge. A slow, genuine smile broke across Caleb's face for the first time in 10 years. A smile that finally laid the ghosts of the Ashfall War to rest. He wasn't hiding anymore. He had walked into the throne room as a ghost from the past, but he was staying as a protector of the future. If you liked the video, make sure to like and subscribe my channel.